Hello and welcome to a new current affairs programme, The Big Question, with myself, Brenda McGrath, and co-presenter Steve Maudsley. The Big Question is a monthly programme looking at the big issues in the news locally or nationally today. This first programme asks the question, is the NHS broken? We will seek to find out what are the problems and talk to experts to see what's going wrong and what can be done. Liverpool Community Radio is an internet radio station staffed by volunteers who have completed LCR training course. Our website is www.l-c-r.co.uk, where you can listen to podcasts of all our shows and find details of current training courses. You can tweet us at LCR, email to studio@l-c-r.co.uk or text to 07890 119 887. So, Steve, how are you?
I'm doing rather well.
All right, so thinking about yourself and your friends and your family, how do you see the NHS, Steve?
But I'd say on the whole, my own experience from my own visits to the NHS have always been positive.
Well, that's what most people say. I mean, this particular question was put forward by Steve Farragher, who's the director here. And he will speak to us later, who has had a lot of dealings in the last 18 months with the NHS. And he said to me, there's so many problems that come up in the press and people talk about and, scandals. And yes, he had wonderful service. So he wanted to know a little bit more why the NHS was said to be broken. Now, I work attached to the NHS, so I've been in and out of NHS hospitals and around the system for a long time. And it is absolutely wonderful for acute situations, and the expertise is fantastic. But it seems to me what's happening is access to those things. Certain sections like chronically ill and older people, getting through your GP and waiting times, it seems to be that where the problems arise, rather than if you go in for a heart operation or cancer treatment or
the actual treatments.
Kidney. The actual treatments and the expertise once you're there in those sort of, you call them acute really, is brilliant. In chronically ill, where you need lots of attention, or with older people, or getting into that, the referral system, that's what seems to be the problem. But we'll talk about this later. So let's take a break. In the next section, we'll look at what politicians tell us about the NHS and talk to a recent patient to find out their experience. You're listening to The Big Question on Liverpool Community Radio with me, Brenda McGrath, and Steve Maudsley. Now, The Big Question today is the NHS broken? The NHS started in July 1948. It was born via Aneurin Bevan, who was the Health Secretary then for Labour, and he opened Park Hospital in Manchester, and it was the climax of a hugely ambitious plan to bring good health care to all. For the first time, hospitals, doctors, nurses and pharmacists, opticians and dentists were brought together under one umbrella organisation to provide services that were free for all at the point of delivery. Prior to that, it had all been private, and my parents and their grandparents could remember when you had to save up 2 and 6, which is around 12 pence these days, to go to the hospital or to go to the GP or the doctor, and if you didn't go, people would die, and certainly there was a lot of infant mortality and so forth. So this was, after the war, a way of improving the health and public health of the general population, and it was supposed to be providing a land fit for heroes after the war. The central principles are clear. The health service will be available to all and financed entirely from taxation, which means that people pay into it according to their means, and that still exists today. Now, I'm going to play you some clips to try and explain to you the background of the NHS. And the first clip is from the King's Fund off YouTube. It's a charity, the King's Fund. It was from the King Edward's Hospital when they were not privatised. They had to be paid for before the NHS, but they still exist, and they're a think tank for improving health issues in the NHS, and they are very well highly thought of as being progressive. So can we have that, Steve?
So let's start with the likes of me and you, the electorate. We go to the polling booths and elect a government to be in charge of this country and make decisions on our behalf. The government forms a cabinet in which loads of different spending departments are represented. Let's look at the Department of Health. Between the Department of Health and the Prime Minister, there's a Secretary of State for Health. The one you've probably heard of most in connection with the NHS reforms is Andrew Lansley. He was in post until September 2012, and he was the architect of the health reforms we're currently living with, although we'll see they're quite different from what he originally intended. Lansley's view was that there was a whole load of unnecessary red tape in the NHS that was stifling clinicians' ability to deliver high-quality care. What really needed to happen was for the money for NHS services to go directly from the Department of Health into the hands of GPs. Why GPs? Well, because a lot of NHS spend is determined by what they do, and because they're the people that see patients on a day-to-day basis and arguably have the greatest understanding of what those patients need. However, giving £80 billion to a group of people who have never dealt with that size of budget did not go down well with a number of different people. So what we've actually ended up with is something a little bit different from what Lansley originally intended. About £65 billion of the NHS £100 billion budget is going to organisations called clinical commissioning groups, or CCGs. They're made up of GPs, but there's also representatives from nursing, the public and hospital doctors. Their job is to try to improve the health of their bit of the population. How do they do that? Well, part of the way they do it is by commissioning, choosing and buying, services for their population. They can commission services from a range of different organisations, including hospitals, community health services and the private and voluntary sectors. All of these have to be registered with the healthcare regulators, the Care Quality Commission and Monitor. So in CCGs, we've got people who are largely medical professionals who may have had some experience of commissioning, but they need quite a lot of support to fulfil this role. There's two different bodies that support them. The first one is commissioning support units. There's about 20 of these. They're set up to provide technical support to CCGs. They crunch data, they can do contract negotiations and some technical contract management. They're there as a resource for CCGs to draw on if they want to. Another body that provides support is clinical senates. When Lansley issued his vision to give all the money to GPs, there was an outcry in various areas, including from hospital doctors, saying, actually, the complexity of some of our patients is far beyond the knowledge of GPs, so it's going to be difficult for them to commission services they don't really understand. So the idea of clinical senates is to bring together a whole range of medical professions to offer advice to CCGs on particular patient groups or conditions. For example, if you're a CCG trying to commission services for people with heart disease, you might want to get the view of a cardiologist. Well, you can go to a clinical senate for that. They're there to offer advice. CCGs don't have to listen to it. So we've got this collection of around 200 CCGs in England commissioning services locally. But the NHS is a national system and is really high in the minds of the electorate. So there needs to be something that looks at the system from a wider perspective. So we've got an organisation called NHS England. It was originally conceived as a small and lithe organisation. If anyone's got problems sleeping, I'd recommend that rather than counting sheep, they list off all the activities that this small and lithe organisation is going to undertake. You'll find that it stretches to a number of pages. What's NHS England there to do? It's there to do specialist commissioning. So it buys services for conditions that affect a relatively small number of people. To make sure that there's access across the country to these services, it makes sense to commission them regionally or nationally. NHS England also commissions GP services. CCGs don't do this because that would mean commissioning services from themselves, which would make for some interesting contract negotiations, although they do have some responsibility for improving the quality of primary care. There's more than 4,000 people who are employed by NHS England. Some of them are at a central office in Leeds, and we've got 4 regional offices too, as well as around 25 area teams who are playing the NHS England role at a local level. So the original plan was to have a devolved system, but a lot of power will actually be held centrally by NHS England. Another part of the vision was that politicians should be less able to interfere in the day-to-day running of the NHS. The laws changed to give the Secretary of State a lot less power to get involved, although most people are quite cynical about how much this will happen. Let's get back to the likes of you and I going to the polls back in 2010. We had a number of choices on offer to us, one of which was not the coalition government we ended up with. Like all coalition policy, current health policy is a compromise between parties. And there's some interesting things when you look at this policy. One is the influence of the Liberal Democrats. We know that the Liberal Democrats are really interested in localism and local democracy. If Lansley saw GPs as a way of understanding what people need, the Liberal Democrats see local government as their way in. Public health, or how we keep the public healthy, has long been the territory of the NHS, with things like healthy eating and smoking cessation campaigns. What the health reforms have done is move public health and their budgets over to local government and another new national body, Public Health England. Another role that local governments have got is to establish health and wellbeing boards. These bring together key players in the health and social care system, including local councillors, to improve care in a joined-up way across health, social care and other public services. They'll be talking to CCGs and, really crucially, to their electorate. We shouldn't forget Health Watch, which will exist at a national and local level, where it's the responsibility of local government to set it up. It's there to represent the views of patients and for people to engage in how services are planned. In reality, that's quite difficult, and previous attempts to do this by the NHS haven't been successful. There are loads of organisations that we haven't even mentioned yet that also have an important role to play in this health and social care system. What we've got in front of us is a picture of considerable complexity, and whether you're a health professional working in this structure or a patient trying to navigate your way through, it can be quite challenging.
Want to know the inside story of the NHS? Want to know the reason for cuts? Listen to the Big Question programme. Each month, Liverpool Community Radio will discuss a big question in the news, with alternative views and controversial comments. So listen to the Big Question with me, Brenda McGrath and Steve Maudsley. Check out our tile on the LCR website, www.l-c-r.co.uk, to find out all about the Big Question. You're listening to the Big Question on Liverpool Community Radio, Brenda McGrath and Steve Maudsley, and it's Is the NHS Broken? So there you had a representative from the King's Fund talking about the current structure of the NHS. I hope you had your pens and paper handy, because it was quite complicated, but did tell you how it's running today. Let's move on now to the political aspect of this. And this is a clip of Andy Burnham. Now, he's the Shadow Secretary of State for Health for the Labour Party, talking about privatisation that's happening in the NHS, which may contribute to these problems. So let's listen to Andy Burnham. This is at a conference earlier this year.
The reason why people love and trust the NHS is because, for all of its faults, it is a service that is based on people, not profits. That principle sets our health service apart in the world and was famously celebrated at the opening ceremony of our Olympic Games. But it is under real threat. NHS privatisation is now proceeding at a pace and scale never seen before, as commissioners are forced to put services out to the market. For the first time, NHS spending on private and other providers has just broken through the 10 billion barrier. Here in Greater Manchester, patient transport services were handed to a bus company without patients ever being consulted. It is indefensible for the character of the country's most valued institution to be changed in this way without the public first being given a say. But the speed of change is about to increase. Labour publishes new analysis today which shows that NHS privatisation is entering new territory and becoming harder to reverse. In Cambridgeshire, one of the single biggest privatisations of services ever seen could be signed off in the months before the election. This £800 million contract covers services for older people and will run for the 5 years of the next Parliament from 2015 to 2020. This is not acceptable. Contracts like this will tie the hands of the next government in a crucial area of public policy. But even worse, they are being signed without a mandate from the public. The Prime Minister was not upfront about these plans at the last election, and he now needs to be reminded that he has never been given the permission of the public to put their NHS up for sale. Further privatisation of services should not proceed until the public has had a proper say. So today I've written to the Chief Executive of NHS England to ask that no further contracts for NHS clinical services are signed until after the next election, when we've had a chance to have that debate, except where there are issues of patient safety or threats to service provision that need to be addressed urgently. Now, this will give the country the chance to have a proper debate and to decide what kind of health service it wants in the 21st century. And it will reserve the rights of the next government to decide how best to take the NHS forward.
This is Brenda McGrath, and you're listening to Liverpool Community Radio and the Big Question, which is the NHS broken? So there you had three clips, one from the King's Fund explaining how the NHS has changed during the last 5 years and the setup as it is today. And then an illustration of the pressures that are on A&E doctors in an A&E department in London. And Andy Burnham talking about privatisation and how they're trying to stem the proliferation of privatisation before the next election. So let's now take a break, and when we come back, we're going into section 2. Now, in this, we have Steve Farragher, who's recently been a patient both in A&E with a broken wrist and also prior to that as having a bypass in a local hospital here in Liverpool. So let's take a break and we'll come back with section 2. Want to know the inside story of the NHS? Want to know the reason for cuts? Listen to the Big Question programme. Each month, Liverpool Community Radio will discuss a big question in the news, with alternative views and controversial comments. So listen to the Big Question with me, Brenda McGrath and Steve Maudsley. Check out our tile on the LCR website, www.l-c-r.co.uk, to find out all about the Big Question. I'm now going to go into an interview with Steve Farragher, who has had an inside experience of a couple of hospital departments in the last year, and he tells us his experience, what he thinks may be the way forward for the future of the NHS. So welcome, Steve Farragher.
Hello, Brenda.
Back in the chair again.
I know, yeah.
Now then, you in the last year and a half, 2 years, you've had a bypass.
Yes.
And you've also broken your wrist.
Yes.
And this show particularly was put together because you said to me, we should be asking some big questions. And you told me that you'd had a really good experience in hospital, and yes, it was getting a lot of bad press.
Yeah.
Is that right? So what was your experience? So, I mean, I know you were taken in with pains in your chest at the beginning of that. Then you went from one hospital to another. And it seemed to go quite seamlessly, and it was a really good service. Would you say that?
Funnily enough, it's just it's exactly 12 months since it all happened, and I can't really. I've got no criticisms at all of the experience that I had, just on a sort of day-to-day basis, but also on the actual way, the treatment itself. I mean, that's down to, personally what was wrong with me. So I can't really say, that's down to the NHS itself. That's just down to what my personal sort of circumstances were health-wise. I can't really fault the way, the amount of time it took me from the time I was taken into accidents and emergency, what turned out to be a heart attack.
That was in Southport, which is about 25 miles away from Liverpool.
And so the actual, the join up between Southport in particular and Liverpool and, the Broad Green Hospital.
Heart and Chest Hospital. That's Liverpool Heart and Chest Hospital,
there's obviously a great deal of... I can't really fault the link between the two organisations because they're like 20 miles apart. I was referred to the hospital after less than a week. They had their own heart specialist there who looked at the results they had from the test and decided to refer me on. And once I arrived at Broad Green, they basically wouldn't let me out. Also be a bad thing, really. But at the same time, there was lots of criticisms of Cardiff Hospital. And people were dying because they were taking 18 months to make that journey, that it was umpteen of these operations every day. Within 12 days of me having the heart attack, I was being operated. Yeah, I'm sure that there's other places in the country where that doesn't happen as good as that. Or, the standard of the actual operations isn't as good or whatever. But all the follow-up and everything else has all gone really well. There was.
But I think that's probably. I mean, my experience, as you know, I do medical market research, and I've been in all those hospitals, and I've seen all it in the background, and it does vary. So it is a bit of a lottery, and I think that's because the trust system that was set up, which was set up under the last Labour government, they're probably all self-determining, you see. So there's best practice. Yeah. There's always best practice. But then, whether it's down to funding or down to the expertise of the doctors or the administrators, it probably will, the process will vary.
You get the impression that there's also worse practice, and because of some of the targets that they're given, they're frightened to admit that they're doing things wrong. Now, one of the things that happened to me, again, going on the internet, is you can go and check on your consultant.
That's new. That's
to give you the success rate, you know what I mean? And when I had a little chat with the guy, he was basically, you do ask, the questions.
How many have died on you?
Well, exactly, because at the end of the day, you can't do anything about it. You're unconscious on the table. Yeah. But he said, it's a good 12 years since I've lost someone on the table, which I sort of felt quite relieved that he was able to sort of say that, and he wasn't skating around it.
With heart problems, I have to say this, it's heart operations. Quite often, in my experience, from what I know, it doesn't happen on the table, it happens after.
Yeah.
It happens with, blood clots and how you're looked after and things like that, and rehabilitated.
I think it's how ill you are when you go in for the operation as well.
I was just going to say that. And so obviously frail elderly and someone who's ill.
Now, I was told that one of the things that came out of this was, although it needed the operation doing, the actual heart function was quite good, because I don't smoke and I don't drink, you see, so I hadn't been damaging the heart in the way that they're normally damaged. So the whole sort of process was good, but that as you said before, that could have been sort of like a lottery. What we got here in Liverpool should be everywhere.
Of course, and it probably is in those cases. Yeah. So I think there's probably, from what you're saying there, if we are, we can make a sort of a comment on this, is that sort of process should be translated throughout the whole. It should be joined up through all. But
I think one of the issues is, and we're so political now, is that the National Health Service wasn't really an issue until Margaret Thatcher got her hands on it and decided she was going to reform it. Now, since that point in the early 90s, when she decided to bring more management into, I think one of the things she said, she wanted it run like Marks and Spencer's, which is a bit, what you do if you pass your sell-by date type of thing. Did you stick you in a skip outside? Ever since she decided to get involved in it, it has become more of a political football.
I think it is a political football, but I think there's a reason behind that. And I mean, it doesn't matter what side of the political sort of spectrum you are, but it is. I was listening yesterday. They went and asked people on the news somewhere what they thought was the percentage of the GDP, I guess, is it?
Yeah.
Or that's spent. The pie that's spent on public services. And I think education was something like 8 to 10%. Now, the NHS was 18%. So that's quite a lot. I think it was a little bit more than defence, to be frank.
It's a massive spend, and it's also the biggest employer in the country, the National Health Service.
That's why they always want to get it down to a business proposition, because it's so much money.
Well, you've got to remember, you were talking about people's health, and you're talking about it's not a business. You know what I mean? It's like if people need something doing, they need it doing. And I think the idea that it's become like a political football, it benefits the Labour Party more than anyone else, really. And,
well, it does,
and in a sense, there needs to be, there needs to be some sort of political agreement on it, really. The description of what National Health Service is needed for the country should be something.
The idea of privatisation, which is always very, very, prominent within when the Tories are in power, it's inevitable that will be so. Is that the key question they say there, the pundits, certainly on the right, is it's always going to be free at the point of delivery. That's now. But underneath all that, the structure is being sold off piecemeal. I mean, at the moment, I'm doing some work with alcoholics, really, or recovering, and in addiction centres. And they've just, the whole shebang in another city, I won't name which one, has been sold off to a privately. So they're going to run it. Now, the people who are going into those addiction centres don't know that. So they just go and carry on. But the point is, if it was ever decided that they weren't going to treat people for addiction, the government, they would have to pay to go. So that's what's happening underneath.
Yeah.
You're having pieces sold off in the event that they're hived off, and that is quite.
Well, they've already done that. There's some operations that are not being carried out now.
One.
Yeah, well, I've got this thing called the poisons contractia, and now that's been taken off.
Is that in the hand?
Yeah, that's the list of things that don't get done anymore because it's not seen as.
And nowadays, I mean, I was listening to there was someone came on, one of these administrators, and there's just you now have to be severely deaf to get hearing aids. You can't be mild to moderately. So they're shoving out those people. Presumably on benefits, you'll get it free. But if you're sort of a very low income, from now on, you're going to have to buy those.
But you've got to, just a simple recognition that if there's a private company involved in any process, they've got to make profits on it. If it costs X pounds to do something, it's got to cost X pounds plus Y, which is their profit. In some respect, Thatcher was right in the sense that the management needed sharpening a bit, but not to the extent that it did happen.
But it was inevitable, I think, under those sort of right-wing sort of theories that it was going to happen. Because really, they don't want a national health service.
Well, they want people to pay for stuff, don't they?
To pay for it.
But the thing is, you see, that's a fairly, when I say fairly recent, it's something from the last 30-odd years. And I wasn't around at this point, but I don't hear of anyone saying that in the 1950s, when Conservatives come back in 51, there was any sort of like, we're going to start dismantling the health service.
Well, the consensus was, of course, it was brought in by Aaron Bevan, and we discussed this previously in the programme. He brought it in July the 5th, 1948, actually. And the central principles were the health service will be available to all, finances from the white paper, financed entirely from taxation, which means that people pay into it according to their means. That's socialism.
It had only been in existence 3 years then before the Conservatives got back in again. So if anybody was going to start dismantling it and changing it, it should have been really in 1951, but nothing happened until 1982,
because I think
83.
It was after the war, wasn't it? And the thing was to make it a land fit for heroes. And they wanted not to go back to the way it was in the 30s and make it so that there was a better fit land and built houses, and they put prefabs up, and this was all part of that thinking. I think,
and this should be like a political consensus now. I think there's an opportunity, because all that's going to happen is we're going to have this tennis match each time someone comes in. We had it with the last one, in 2010. The Conservatives, they weren't going to make any changes, and they've spent the last 3 or 4 years spending several £billion.
Well, I think there should be a consensus. You mean to make it sort of so that that's enough?
I think for the good of the country, you need to have some sort of consensus between the two main parties.
It's in a computer, not the computer design. I think that
otherwise you're wasting money, and what it is, the more money that's wasted.
Not only that, but aside from that, particularly with the National Health Service, people in this country. Generally, I'm talking about the ones that are earning under 20,000 a year, we'll say, and maybe even those under 30,000. Because of the way things are, and things are so expensive, and particularly, houses, mortgages, there are things that are going down, which is, food prices going down. But there isn't that much disposable income in there to be able to add in costs. For care. You couldn't just say, well, you're going to have to pay for
there's
care.
No disposable income for insurance either, for health insurance, and this is like, people keep saying, and it's the UKIP who started this, was saying, well, people will need to provide health insurance and use like the French model, where you have a combination of National Health Service and personal health service.
Claim it back.
But that's not, that's never going to happen, because at the moment everyone's working through stuff.
Or they're on 0 hours, so they haven't got enough. Really speaking, they can't aspire to anything because the money's all.
So this is why I think there's got to be, a general agreement, and I think if one of the parties, and I think it should be the Labour Party that does, because it gives the Labour Party a political advantage to say we're in favour of the NHS. And really, they should be shooting the fox, really.
Well, they're not. That's their credo, isn't it, with the NHS to do that? I think that is a case where they can go full throttle on socialist ideals. With the economy, they've got to be careful. You can't just say, well, we're going to stop the cuts.
I'm saying is they should be trying to get back to the spirit of 48 and sort of say, well, look, people do not want to lose the health service, and anyone who makes any inroads into like UKIP have had to backpedal on what they've said.
But there has been, to go back to the health service, is it broken, which is the question for today. Would you say that it is broken because so many old people, because it's overwhelmed, or would you say it's been broken by various...
It's not broken. I think it's patched up, and I think it's partially to the fact that the political swing goes backwards and forwards, so someone will do something to it. Instead of like designing a National Health Service that everyone politically agrees with and everyone agrees what the cost should be. If that means that there has to be some sort of insurance in that as well, then you write that into it, so it becomes something that's collected every week, or people who are rich, you have to pay.
And I think people, if a case was put to them and they saw how it had to be, then probably there would be consensus with the public as well. But the big problem, and it's not about people, old people, and it's sort of vilified. It's not about that. It's because there isn't enough. The reason why they bed block, terrible term, that, but it's true, is there isn't enough care in the community.
Yeah, well, that's this idea of creating one budget, isn't it? Which is what the Conservatives say they do now. But you're always suspicious of the motives behind doing something like that.
Well, they create one budget, then they cut it, and then you've got a bigger problem. Or they shove it off to. They shove it off to like councils, and then cut the council budget what they've done here. So overall, what do you think the answer is? Do you think then you had wonderful service?
Yeah.
You've been very, very lucky, and obviously you went. And when you had your wrist done recently, that was a good experience.
Again, that was.
But there are cases. Smith Staff is one. All the babies that died up in Morecambe's another. And I know I've been into hospitals when you think, thank God I'm not.
But that's to do with bureaucracy, and that's to do with a faulty local system. And in effect, I'm not sure whether it would work as a completely national system, but that's down to creating individual trust with individual targets, and then you get sort of the insidious management creep, don't you, where sort of the target becomes the reason for doing things, not the actual outcome with the patient.
So overall, you'd say that you don't think it is broken. It's heaving, and it needs a really good reassessment.
It's limping, basically.
Yeah. All right, thanks for that.
Okay.
Stay well. Right, well, thanks for doing this. Welcome back. This is Liverpool Community Radio, and you're listening to The Big Question, which is the NHS broken? There you were listening to an interview I did with Steve Farragher, who's director here, who not only has had first-hand experience of the NHS over the last year or so, but also, as you heard, has some profound views. And it's very interesting to get testimony like that, because probably it is reflective of a lot of people in this country. So everyone loves the NHS. There are really, really good practices, and then there are some problems. So to address these, Professor John Ashton, who is at the moment is the president of the UK Faculty of Public Health Doctors, he kindly came in and we did an interview with him to find out what he thinks. Now, he was originally Public Health Director for NHS Cumbria and Cumbria County, is a pioneer of 3 public health initiatives. He has criticised both the UK Labour Party and the UK Conservative Party health reforms in the past. And in February 2012, the government response to his criticism of Health and Social Care Bill in 2011 was talked about and raised in Parliament, where he reckoned that the reforms would totally dismantle the NHS. So let's listen to what he has to say, in his opinion, as an experienced person and doctor who has been in the NHS and public health service for 30 years. Right, well, thanks for doing this. And we're here today with Professor John Ashton, who is the president of the Public Health...
UK Public Health Faculty.
Oh, UK Public Health Faculty, thanks for that. Now, you've been quite... I think in 2010 or 2012, you actually criticised the government, the Tory government, of course, for proposals they were making to the NHS. And the NHS, of course, was a great concept in 1945 when it was started. And principally, it runs much the same way. But what concerns do you have about what's happening today? Because earlier in this programme, we have had people in telling us how wonderful it is. They've had, major heart operations or cancer treatments. And then there's another side to it, which seems to be a pressure that's building up in the health service. Do you think that's a genuine pressure, or do you think it has been devised?
No, there are real pressures. I mean, it's quite a complex story, this. You have to remember that when the NHS was set up in 1948, there was a huge backlog of folk who hadn't had access to medical care. The 1911 Lloyd George Insurance Act provided cover for working men. Women and children weren't covered, and they were dependent really on charity, on local authority clinics and so on, and it depended just how committed each local authority was to providing for them with children's clinics and so on. So, there was a big backlog in 1948. One of the early crises of the NHS was nobody had anticipated just how many people needed spectacles. There were millions of people who came forward needing glasses. And one of the first inquiries into the NHS was this, because it cost a lot of money. And so it revealed unmet need, even at that time. And of course, at that time, the common experience of working people was that if you were lucky, you got to retirement and had a few years. You got your big watch from the employer, and you had a few years. Now, working folk can look forward if they've been reasonably sensible about their lifestyle, to live well into their 70s, even into their 80s, and people who've had a privileged life are living to be 90, 95, 100.
And active as well.
And active. So we've got, and that began really in about the 1970s, large numbers of people living to a great age. So, the older you live, the more likely you are to accumulate various health problems, long-term things, arthritis things, cholesterol, heart disease things, and so on. And we've now got modern medicine that can help with those things, so the costs have gone up for that reason as well. So there's huge challenges to keep up with that. But I believe, and a lot of us do believe, that it can be done. But it means we do need to reinvent the health service as we go.
What's happening today, then, you think, is not wholly because of what's happened what the Tories are trying to do with the NHS. I mean, there is thought about that, but it's just that you've got more people who are ageing, and it's become more pressurised to deal with it and more costly. And there's new treatments coming in all the time for everything, isn't there? It's more sophisticated.
Absolutely right. And you see, I mean, the thing is that, you know, those of us who earn our living in public health and looking at these things, you know, we're aware of what was building up, the pressure that was building up. We were 25 years ago. When Sir Derek Wanless looked at funding of the NHS for Gordon Brown in the millennium period to see if the NHS should have more money, he came back with the answer, yes, you know, we should go from about 6% of gross national products spent on health to about 8%. But we should only do that if we went for what he called the fully engaged scenario, which was about prevention, public health and so on, and developing strong community care in general practice.
And that hasn't happened.
And it hasn't happened. And instead we squandered a lot of the money on PFI deals to build new hospitals, which are costing us a fortune. Public finance initiatives.
And that was with private firms, but it was also a very big on cost, wasn't it? Interesting.
Well, it was at the sort of interest rates that were around at that time, right. And we've now had interest rates of 0.5% for quite a number of years, but we're still paying at these rates 7 or 8% or whatever for the next 20 odd years on these buildings.
So would you say then that, given what you've just said, that the NHS can still be free at the point of delivery in the future?
I think so. I think we need to have a much more of a commitment to prevention and public health, to stop people getting things that are avoidable. I mean, that's why all the argument about tobacco, about minimum unit price of alcohol,
vaccinations.
Vaccinations, of course, but also, you know, sugary drinks for children and so on.
To try and stop illnesses.
To stop illnesses that are avoidable, and which, you know, a segment of the population, which tends to be middle-class folk and, you know, and people who are well off and so on, they tend to have that, and it's the more disadvantaged at the moment who tend not to be in that boat.
Well, I suppose there's a public education issue there, but also it's probably just cheaper, isn't it? It's cheap food.
That's absolutely right, because, you know, the agricultural producers, the whole food chain, the processing of food, the marketing of food, once they've produced high-fat carcasses of animals, they don't throw it away. It finishes up somewhere in the food chain, and people on low income tend to finish up buying those kind of cuts of meat and so on for their children, just to keep their stomachs full. So, you know... And
there's an issue of pressure of time. I mean, my mum, and me certainly when my children were growing up, because I didn't work as hard as most women do today, you could buy fresh each day, and you could buy cheap cuts of meat like brisket and things like that, which take long to cook. Yeah. But people don't seem to have the time to do that either, do they?
Well, ironically, I mean, this may be an issue to do with the ageing population, and one of the reasons why the big supermarkets are in trouble is there's been something of a return to this shopping several times a week, but it may be because you've got such a big retired population that's got the time to go shopping several times a week to neighbourhood shops.
Maybe there is a revival in growing your own and, you know, not wanting to be at the mercy of preservatives in prepared foods.
Oh, yeah. And if you go, I mean, in, you know, the fashionable and expensive residential districts, places like Islington in London, there's been a revival of neighbourhood shops of fruit and veg and fish shops and so on, you know, where people can afford to do that. So these are quite big questions. I mean, they're questions that touch on poverty, on minimum unit, minimum wage, you know.
But that's at the sort of the public health and education end. But the other end of that, with a lot of people who become ill and not able to get out of their homes, this turns into a crisis for the NHS and revolving door, because there isn't enough care in the community.
Well, and a lot of, you know, the frail elderly, particularly frail elderly women, need to be kept out of hospital because it's not good for them. I mean, you know, once they're in there, it's difficult for them to be discharged back to their home. They lose their confidence, they go off their feet. And what we really need is much stronger general practice and community support community nurses.
Been talked about for such a long time, but the money never seems to reach that.
Well, no, because every year, at the end of the financial year, this time of year, you're coming into February, March, and the NHS hospitals and everyone has to balance the books. The hospitals come begging for money to top up to balance the books again, and the money that should have been spent on prevention doesn't get spent on prevention.
So what's the answer to this then? Is it better management? Do you need a commissioner overseeing this all, like a huge big matron in the sky? What's going to happen?
Well, I've just written a piece for the British Medical Journal. It'll be out soon, and I'm saying what we really need is a Secretary of State for Public Health at the Cabinet, and we need a National Director of Public Health who's got access to other government departments to influence what goes on there. And we need, the democratic deficit, which means that all these quangos that we've now got, these hospital trusts and all the rest of it, which are basically appointed through London, they're not accountable locally, and you have people who are cloning themselves.
But it used to be, didn't they?
Yeah,
they used to have management boards.
Well, we used to have local councillors on them, but I think we should have directly elected health boards that are accountable to the local people, and that's part of the story. But there was a study done a few years ago of Fazakerley Hospital, and basically a kind of census of who was in the beds. Now, Fazakerley's got about 800 beds, and when they did this census, they found that about 300 of the patients didn't need to be there. Out of 800.
Now, what did that mean? They were waiting to go home?
Lots of them waited to go home, had housing problems, may have had a stroke, couldn't go back to the house that they'd been in.
Need a halfway house.
Yeah. And yet the health service has been really poor at having relationships with housing providers, with housing associations and so on.
Because it's standalone, isn't it? That's why.
Yeah.
It's just a standalone entity, these trusts. It doesn't seem to be part of the community, which is basically what you're saying, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that the hospitals have been very inward-looking historically, and not looking out. But it goes back before that. My own view is that if you get to 60 or so, you really need to take stock of your housing needs. And we need policies that enable people to move into something smaller, perhaps, but not very far away, so they don't lose their social networks and their support. But you may be able to move into a 2-bedroom apartment, so they're ready for the next 20 or hopefully 30 years.
But that's a concept that happens in other countries. It doesn't happen here so much, does it?
It's not strategic, it's not planned. We allow housing to be...
People don't want to do that either, do they? They don't want to move away from their communities, and they don't want to really... it's a very emotional tie, your house, isn't it?
Your house is an emotional tie, but if you look what well-off folk in South Manchester or South Liverpool are doing, you look at McCarthy and Stone developments, that's what's happening.
They're expensive, aren't they?
Yeah, that's what's so we need the same in public housing, in social housing.
Yeah.
You need to be able to move to the end of the street or around the corner.
I think we've discussed this before, because what I would personally would never want to do is go into an old age ghetto like they do in Florida.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want that. But you could move in your own area to somewhere like a little bungalow or a little 2-bedroom apartment.
That's what's needed. That's what's needed, because
as long as you could have an animal, I'd be all right.
Well, then, people can stay at home, independent living. Even if they develop dementia, we know that if people are in the right kind of housing, they can stay in their own house longer.
There isn't the will to put the money into that infrastructure, is there, at the moment?
Well, except that every year we spend billions on housing, but it's the wrong kind of housing that's still being built. And we've got the legacy of the 60s and 70s of these on the edge of the town places that are dependent on you having your own car, and as you get older, most of us will finish up, if we live long enough, not being able to drive our car, not being allowed to drive our car.
You've got to take that into account.
So we need, it's better that people are in urban villages, the urban centres where there's public transport.
Because I know what happens, and I can sort of, perhaps not yourself, but probably you resource them in every way, but you can see. What happens is, what would happen to me if I didn't do that, is eventually you're going to give yourself up just to the state, because you don't make you either haven't had the ability to, the money to, or the wherewithal or the thought to prepare.
And there's very few
people... So you're just waiting to get ill.
There's very few people who are in that position, I'm fortunate that, I'm a doctor, I've been well paid and so on, and, we've been able to do the amendments to the House so that hopefully my intention is not to go into a care home at any price. That's my intention.
I always find that with professionals. That's doctors. Everybody always
no chance. I want to be parked in the front parlour for a day or two and go out in a box.
Me too. But you have to have. That's all planning, and it's not cultural to plan for that normally.
No, it's
for average people.
Well, we need to talk about that. That's another issue, is talking about the later years of your life, the end of life years, your last weeks and months, what you want. I've done work when I was working...
And that would keep the pressure off the NHS, because at the moment people go home and they're back in there within a year.
It costs a fortune to admit elderly people to hospital when they're nearing the end of life, and it's not going to make much difference.
Isn't there a case for more GP and primary care involved in this, but because of the pressures on GPs, that's becoming less?
Well, I also think that, it goes back to medical student selection. To get into medical school these days, you need to have starred A grade A levels.
Well, it always was so in the medical profession.
Well, no, they wouldn't have me. Now they wouldn't have me. I got an A, a B, and a C. I wouldn't get in today.
Well, I didn't realise that. I thought they always took the cream of the.
No. Well, in the old days, when I went to Newcastle with an average of 3 Bs, I could have got into Liverpool with 1 grade less, because they always offered 1 grade less to local pupils at Liverpool. Okay. They offered, they favoured local students. But today, you've got very, very bright students, maybe brighter than you need to be, and the question is whether they've got the orientation and the aptitude to do the sort of work that general practices need, the empathy side of things, because the recruitment into general practice of medical graduates is much lower than it needs to be. We need half of medical graduates to go into general practice, and that's not happening at the moment.
Right. So what as opposed to what's happening now? What's happening now then?
Well, they all want to stay in hospital medicine.
I see what you mean.
And do.
Well, so I see. So you make it sort of. Well, it's a little bit like the argument with nurses, isn't it? Nurses are supposed to now have a university degree. In actual fact, you want nurses
practical nursing. Well,
going to be doing hands, if you like.
Florence Nightingale, when she established community nursing here in Liverpool, and Agnes Jones, who did all the donkey work for Florence, they literally were getting women out of the gutter, alcoholic women and women who are down and outs, and training them up as nurses. They had a big argument whether they should pay them any wages or not, because there was an argument that if you paid them, they'd just drink it, but they took ordinary women and gave them practical nursing skills.
That was like the nurses that used to go around the areas, the district nurses and people like that. They started from the community.
There are a lot of young girls and young lads. I'm not suggesting that they're alcoholic and in the gutter, but there's a lot of them who not necessarily had a good time at school, but who could be trained up as good practical nurses.
And would perhaps like to do that as well.
Absolutely.
Well, it's like everything else. It's like in life, isn't it? Everything has become more specified. What started out, it's like soccer teams, isn't it? What started out as playing on a field with 2 tribes has now become
Sunday school and factory, yes.
Exactly, now it's become a multi-million-pound business, so it's sort of an analogy there.
It is the over-professionalisation.
Yeah.
When, my view is there's a certain level of achievement in school exams, let's say 3 Bs or something like that you need to be able to deal with a medical course.
Terminology.
And above that, what you want is personality. What you want is people who like people and who get good listening.
Yeah, good location. So overall, do you think then that, say, in 10 years' time, the NHS will look the same as it is today?
Well, I think...
Is that too short time period?
Well, it will either have failed altogether and will have been pushed...
And do you think that's what they're being pushed towards?
Well, I think the Lansley so-called reforms, which was like putting a hand grenade under the NHS, which is so fragmented now, there's so much duplication, there's so much confusion.
Do you think it's being set up to fail?
Well, people have said that, and it may well be the case, and the privatisation agenda. It's very uncoordinated now. So unless we get it back on track, it may well fail, or we will finish up, we'll be pushed into a situation where you have to take out private health insurance. Yeah. But on the other hand, if we can regroup it, get these other things in place to reduce demand by having decent education on health matters in schools, so that people know how to look after themselves, people know how to treat ordinary common conditions for themselves, or by going to the chemist. We can reduce demand.
Like the old mother's remedies.
All that. The wisdom that we've lost. And then at the other end of the age scale, if we can keep people out of hospital with good, not on the cheap, but with good community care that will save money.
I think in Liverpool they are trying to do that. I know Ros Gladden she's the mayoral lead for elderly care, and she's very keen. They started hubs in Liverpool, didn't they?
No, I think Liverpool are, in a sense, trailblazing in what's needed, but we need to up the pace. There needs to be more of a national commitment and leadership about this agenda.
Do you think if the Labour win the next election, or at least in coalition is probably more likely, do you think they'd be able to save it? Do you think that it would be 5 years long enough?
Things have to happen quite urgently after the election. I mean, we've had 5 lost years for the health service now, from 2010. We've had 5 lost years. So there's urgent things that need to happen. I think Andy Burnham is saying a lot of the right things. But to really get things back on track is a 5 to 10 year task, I think. If we are going to save it, we need clarity of the vision of what needs to happen, because it can't carry on the same. It's got to change. But that's not about privatisation. We need clarity of that. We need strong political leadership to take people through this, where it might mean some people will lose hospitals or lose parts of hospitals because that money's got to be invested in other things. And people need to see that it's actually will be better. You look at what's happened with maternity.
It should be ring-fenced as well, shouldn't it?
Well, I think the public health budget needs to continue to be ring-fenced. But you look at something like maternity, where since the women's hospital was rebuilt, a lot of the women across Merseyside are voting with their feet and having their babies in the women's, because it's such a superb service, a modern service, and they've been coming in from from North Liverpool, coming in from Knowsley, and coming in because the service is so good. So people will accept concentration and centralisation if they can see they're going to get better. Or something like the Broad Green with the heart surgery and so on.
They come from North Wales.
They come from all over, and Alder Hey. Yeah. So people will do it. They will accept it if they can see it's going to be better. Yes. And that message has to be sold to people.
So are you sorry that I presume you're going to come up to retirement at some stage? Proper retirement.
I've retired twice so far.
Well, you miss the NHS. I mean,
I'm not working in the NHS now. The role I've got now, which is president of basically the Public Health College in London for the whole of the UK, I'm halfway through that, and I'll finish that in June next year, in 2016. So no, I mean, it'd be nice to not work on a Friday, but I'll always be doing something. I'd like to, to be able to contribute in Liverpool again, because I was on the board of the Museums and Galleries for 4 years, which is just finished, and so I will be looking for things to do locally.
Well, thanks very much for doing that. Hopefully, we'll have you back on again and talk about it in the future.
Oh, thanks, Brenda.
Want to know the inside story of the NHS? Want to know the reason for cuts? Listen to the Big Question programme. Each month, Liverpool Community Radio will discuss a big question in the news, with alternative views and controversial comments. So listen to the Big Question with me, Brenda McGrath, and Steve Maudsley. Check out our tile on the LCR website, www.l-c-r.co.uk. to find out all about the Big Question. Welcome back. You're listening to the Big Question on Liverpool Community Radio with Brenda McGrath and Steve Maudsley. And there you've just been listening to Professor John Ashton, who is the Director of Public Health. He's the President of the UK Faculty of Public Health. And he was talking about his views about the NHS and what he feels should happen in the future to make it better. Now, in this programme, you've heard from people who have experienced the NHS, people who've worked in the NHS, and politicians who have passed comment on the NHS. So, Steve, having listened to all that, what do you think?
I think somebody said in one of the interviews earlier, it's patched up and it's in the process of being dismantled, which I'm afraid I think it is. I think it's been patched up. It's on the cusp of being dismantled. But another thing that Andy Burnham said earlier, which Naira and Bevan said, it should be free at the point of service and non-profit. I think that's the core. From the whole show today, I've taken that. It should be free at the point of service and non-profit. But I'm afraid it's going the other way.
It's very sad, and everybody loves the NHS, and it's a wonderful concept. Personally, I don't think most people in this country want to let it go.
I agree with you.
So therefore, as Steve Farragut said, maybe there should be consensus between politicians and between different political parties to keep that core value and to not make it so that you have to save up for your 2 and 6 to go and visit the GP as you did in the 1930s and the 1940s. I hope you've all enjoyed listening to that and taken from it something a little bit more than what you knew before. We'll be back next month with another big question. This time it's going to be, why more cuts? So stand by, watch our website www.l-c-r.co.uk and watch out for the next programme, which will be the end of April. Bye for now.